Rain lashed the cobblestones of Rome as the iron boots of the Praetorian Guard shattered the... History remembers the decree of Claudius as a political footnote, but for Priscilla, it was a death sentence written in ink. How did a simple tent maker become the most dangerous woman in the capital? What had she seen in the forbidden scrolls that turned her from a merchant into a fugitive in a single hour? As the city gates began to groan shut, Priscilla stood at the precipice of total ruin. Everything she owned, her wealth, her safety, her identity was being stripped away. But as she gripped a small concealed satchel against her chest, the question wasn't whether she would survive. The question was, what did she carry that was worth more than her life? And why was the empire so terrible? The journey from the gates of Rome to the shores of Corinth was not a path of pilgrimage. It was a gauntlet of death. For Priscilla and Aquila, the Appian Way had transformed from a symbol of Roman engineering into a 500-mile stretch of lawless. Behind them, the smoke of their burning workshop still stained the horizon, a bitter reminder of the life they had been forced. But the physical loss was nothing compared to the weight of the contraband they carried, the sacred scrolls and the forbidden teachings that Nero's predecessors were desperate to erase. 10 days into their flight, the nightmare took a tangible shape. Near the desolate crags of the Apennine Mountains, the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves, a band of deserters' men turned into monsters by the brutality of the frontier. These were not soldiers seeking justice, but vultures. As the bandits circled their modest cart, Aquila stepped forward, his hands trembling, but his stance firm. Yet it was Priscilla who noticed the detail that would decide. The leader of the pack, a scarred giant with eyes clouded by fever, clutched a shattered shoulder plate that had been driven. The tension was a physical cord stretched to the breaking point. While the bandits ransacked their meager supplies, Priscilla did not pray for a miracle. She reached into her hidden satchel not for a weapon, but for her heavy-duty bone needles and a spool of reinforcement. With a voice that cut through the mountain wind like a cold blade, she offered a bargain: the giant's life in exchange for their passage. In the flickering light of a campfire, surrounded by men who would kill for a copper coin, Priscilla performed a surgery of necessity. Her fingers, calloused from years of stitching thick goat hair tents, moved with the precision of a master artist. She ignored the stench of gangrene and the glint of daggers at her throat. As she sewed the jagged flesh and stabilized the bone, she whispered words that weren't just about medicine. They were about a... By dawn, the giant breathed, and the dangerous woman of Rome had turned a pack of wolves into a silent escort. They hadn't just survived the road. They had begun to conquer it, proving that the needle was indeed mightier than the sword. Corinth was a city of 1,000 sins, a sweltering melting pot where the scent of the sea mingled with the sweat of 1,000 slaves. For Priscilla and Aquila, it was a place to vanish. They established a new workshop in the shadow of the Acrocorinth, their needles rhythmic and relentless. But the silence they sought was shattered when a man named Paul of Tarsus walked through their... While Aquila welcomed Paul with open arms, Priscilla watched from the shadows of the workbench, her eyes narrowing. She had seen prophets before, men who used silver tongues to drain the pockets of the poor. She didn't trust his credentials. She wanted to see his scars. For the first week, Paul worked alongside them in silence. But at night, Priscilla didn't just listen. She interrogated. Every time Paul began to recite the scriptures, she would interrupt with a piercing question that cut through his theological ivory tower. "You speak of a Messiah who died for the weak," she whispered through the cracks in the wall, her voice sharp as a stiletto. "But have you ever bled for a stranger in an alleyway in Rome?" The room would go silent, the tension between them. One midnight, the debate reached a breaking point. Paul spoke of the freedom found in the Spirit, but Priscilla challenged him with the reality of the chains she had seen in the mines of Laurium. She demanded to know if this gospel was just a beautiful dream or a weapon to break the shackles of the world. In the darkness, Paul stopped talking. Instead, he began to recount his own shipwrecks, his lashings, and the blinding light on the road to Damascus. For the first time, by dawn, the wall between them felt invisible. Priscilla realized that Paul wasn't just another teacher. He was the catalyst she had been waiting for. But she also knew something he didn't. The local spies of the synagogue were already circling their shop. A trap was being set, and Paul's brilliance would be his undoing if she didn't intervene. She picked up a piece of heavy canvas and began to stitch a hidden compartment. If Paul was to be the voice of this movement, Priscilla would have to be its shield. Corinth was no longer just a place of refuge. It had become the nerve center of a spiritual insurgency. Under Priscilla's meticulous eye, the tent-making workshop was transformed into a front for an underground intelligence network. While the Roman authorities looked for soldiers and political rebels, they ignored the insignificant laborers carrying bundles of canvas across the city. Priscilla developed a sophisticated system of steganography. She began stitching specific patterns of broken threads and double knots into the seams of the tents sold to traveling merchants. To a casual observer, it was a minor flaw. To a believer in Ephesus or Philippi, it was a coded map indicating where the next secret gathering would be held. However, shadows always linger where the light is brightest. Among their apprentices was a young man named Silas, not the faithful companion of Paul, but a desperate informant bribed by the local magistrates. Silas had noticed that Priscilla spent more time fixing certain tents than making new ones. One sweltering afternoon, while Priscilla was hidden in the back room encoding a letter from Paul to the Romans, she didn't panic. Through a small gap in the curtain, she saw Silas reaching for the hidden compartment in a heavy goat hair sail. The betrayal was cold, sharp, and immediate. If those documents were found, Paul would be executed by sunset, and the Corinthian church would be strangled in its crib. Priscilla stepped out, not with a weapon, but with a terrifyingly calm expression. "The stitch you're looking for isn't there, Silas," she said, her voice dropping to a low, predatory hum. In a moment of split-second brilliance, Priscilla didn't strike him. Instead, she thrust a needle into her own palm, letting the blood coat the very documents Silas sought to steal. When the guards burst through the door, they found only a clumsy woman tending to a workplace injury and a pile of blood-stained, ruined scraps of leather. She played the part of the distraught, overworked merchant so convincingly that the guards sneered in disgust and left. Silas, paralyzed by her resolve and the sight of her sacrifice, realized he wasn't dealing with a victim, but a commander. Priscilla the air in Ephesus was thick with the scent of incense from the temple of Artemis and the electric energy of a new intellectual titan. Apollos had arrived, a man from Alexandria with a voice like a silver trumpet and a mind like a labyrinth of Greek philosophy. He was sweeping the city off its feet. But as Priscilla watched him speak from the shadows of a marble portico, she didn't. Apollos was dangerous. His brilliance was drawing crowds, but his message was incomplete, a half-truth that could lead the fledgling movement into a dead end of mere philosophy. Priscilla knew that a public confrontation would only bruise his ego and split the community. She needed a different kind of battlefield. The encounter lasted 3 days and 3 nights. It was a brutal intellectual siege. Apollos arrived with the arrogance of a man, used to being the smartest in the room, leaning against a stack of raw hides as if they were a throne. He spoke of logic, of the baptism of John, and of the cosmic order. She didn't use scrolls. She used the very leather they were working on. She grabbed a jagged, scarred piece of hide, the kind used for the cheapest, toughest tents, and threw it at his feet. "You speak of a god of ideas, Apollos," she whispered, her voice echoing in the hollow workshop. "But our God is a God of scars. You preach the..." She began to recount the night in Rome, the blood on the Appian Way, and the agonizing vulnerability of the cross. She dismantled his Alexandrian logic with the raw, bleeding reality of a lived faith. Apollos tried to interrupt, his face flushing with anger, but Priscilla's intensity pinned him to his seat. She showed him that eloquence without the Holy Spirit was just a hollow drum. As the oil lamps flickered out on the 3rd night, the superstar of Ephesus broke. The man who had charmed thousands fell silent before a woman with calloused hands. In that workshop, The orator died. The success of the underground movement had finally hit the one thing the Roman world valued more than God's prophet. Demetrius, the master of the silversmiths' guild, watched his sales of Artemis idols plummet as Priscilla's network expanded. He didn't see a religious threat. He saw a hole in his treasury. By noon, the great theater of Ephesus was a cauldron of boiling rage. Thousands screamed for blood. But while the mob hunted for Paul, Demetrius directed a specialized squad of mercenaries toward the source of the infection, the tent workshop. He didn't want a debate. He wanted an execution. Priscilla heard the roar of the crowd before she saw the smoke. She knew they were coming for the letters, the priceless. As the first torch hit the thatched roof, Aquila rushed to the door, but Priscilla grabbed his arm. "If we fight them with swords, we lose the message," she hissed over the crackle of flames. "We must save the ink." While the workshop began to collapse under the weight of the fire, Priscilla executed a plan of desperate brilliance. She didn't try to carry the heavy chests. Instead, she soaked the heavy goat hair tents in the chaos and thick black smoke. Priscilla used the very techniques of a tent maker to create a vacuum of air near the floor, allowing her to reach the hidden compartment. As the roof timbers groaned and began to shatter, she faced Demetrius at the threshold. He stood there. "Your God has no temple." Demetrius sneered, the fire reflecting in his greedy eyes. Priscilla stood tall, her clothes singed, and her face smeared with ash. "My God doesn't live in silver trinkets made by men who fear poverty," she replied, her voice steady even as the heat blistered the air. With a final calculated heave, she pulled a heavy oil-soaked tarp over the mercenary leader, dousing his torch and plunging the entryway into a momentary suffocating darkness. In that heartbeat of confusion, she and Aquila slipped through a ventilation shaft she had designed weeks prior. They emerged into the starlit alleys of Ephesus, smelling of smoke and victory. The workshop was a ruin, but the records were safe against her. Rome had become a slaughterhouse. Nero, seeking a scapegoat for the Great Fire, had turned his gardens into a stage for human torches. Priscilla and Aquila had returned to the lion's den not out of recklessness, but to preserve the fading heartbeat of the Roman Church. But the net was closing. One evening, a secret courier brought word the Imperial Guard had. Priscilla stood in the center of a cold stone cellar, realizing the catastrophic reality. If the scrolls were destroyed, the history of Christ would be buried under the ashes of Rome. But she was a strategist of the Spirit. For years she had stitched the words of Paul and the memories of Peter into her very soul. The climax came when the guards dragged a young believer named Julia toward the stakes in Nero's garden. Priscilla didn't hide. She stepped into the torchlight, dressed in the humble robes of a seamstress, and demanded an audience with the emperor's chief magistrate. She offered a trade that confused the Roman mind. "I have the scrolls you seek." She lied with a terrifyingly calm smile. She was taken to the palace not as a victim, but as a living book. In the presence of Nero's cruelest advisors, she began to speak. She didn't beg for mercy. She began to recite the teachings of Jesus with such authority that the guards lowered their spears. She wasn't just stalling. She was embedding the truth into the minds of her captors. Every word she spoke was a seed planted in the heart of the empire. She knew she might never walk out of those gilded halls, but as Julia escaped into the night, Priscilla realized her victory. The history books of Rome were written by emperors and generals, men who believed that power was measured in stone and blood. But as the centuries eroded the Colosseum and turned Nero's palace to dust, a different kind of monument remained. Priscilla did not leave behind a cathedral or a statue. She left a blueprint. In the twilight of her life, back in a quiet workshop, far from the prying eyes of the guards, Priscilla performed her final act of defiance. She knew that the names of women and workers were often erased by the pens of official historians. So she took her finest needle, and on the inner linings of the tents, she crafted the parts that would face the traveler while they slept. She embroidered the names of the sisters, the slaves, and the outcasts who had built the church. Priscilla's story ends not with a whimper, but with a roar of silence. She proved that a kitchen table could be an altar, a workshop could be a sanctuary, and a woman with a needle could be more dangerous to an empire than an army. She taught the world that leadership isn't about today. Every time a person speaks truth to power in a quiet room, or a teacher pours wisdom into a student in a forgotten corner, Priscilla's flame flickers back to life. She was the architect of the underground, the living bridge between the ancient word and the modern soul. Her message to us is clear. The world may close the cathedrals, but it can never close the heart of one. Priscilla's life poses a haunting question to our modern world. Are you waiting for a title to lead, or are you ready to turn your daily grind into a sacred mission? She didn't have a pulpit yet. Her influence toppled empires. She didn't have a crown yet. She forged the future. Today, your workshop might be an office, a classroom, or a screen, but the needle of truth is in your hands. Will you remain a spectator of history, or will you start stitching a legacy that outlasts you? Your voice matters. Your quiet courage is the catalyst.